Okay, Byron, thank you for coming down to the Cape.
My pleasure.
Happy to be tasting through these wines. Let's get started.
Okay, so in your glass now we have 2012 Chardonnay, Sonoma Coast. It's it's from the part of the Sonoma Coast known as the Petaluma Gap. That's a little further inland from where Hirsch and some of the famous Sonoma Coast vineyards are located. But it's at a lower elevation, so it's actually a little bit cooler than for closer up by the coast at higher elevation. So I usually pick there around the end of September, beginning of October. One of the things I like about it is because it ripens a little bit later than a lot of the Sonoma Coast vineyards that I work with, holds its acidity. It's an older block. It's probably, I think it's about 30 years old, although don't quote me on that. Clone 4. Because it's I guess it's a little bit like people when you get a few years under your belt, you're maybe not quite as vigorous as you were when you were younger, so it doesn't crop quite as high as a younger vineyard would. Nicely balanced. The wine is treated pretty much naturally, although I don't make any claims to be a quote-unquote natural winemaker. No yeast added. Just barrel fermented and largely neutral oak, a little bit of new. Fairly straightforward winemaking, not a lot of bells and whistles attached to it. Kind of let it do its thing. Finish mallow, usually bottle it just before the next harvest. Basically do as little as in the way of kind of manipulation as I can get away with.
Was American and French oak? Or?
It's all French.
All French?
Mostly, and I have a kind of a group of coopers that I like to use. I won't bore you with all the names. Mostly lightly toasted barrels. By way of explanation, you can use a lightly toasted, medium toast, or a heavy toast barrel. The toast comes from the heat used to bend the staves. I'm trying to get away from that matchsticky character that you get from a high toast barrel. So
I see a lot of medium toast barrels at these wineries. So it's interesting that you're using lightly toasted. And do you feel like that it helps maintain more of the true composure and personality of the grape?
Very much so. Yeah. And a lot of people ask, well, why don't you just do it? Ask me, why don't you just ferment it and age it in stainless steel? Even though I'm trying not to put a big oak stamp in terms of flavor on the wine, there is no question in my mind that aging in a barrel is better than aging in a tank. It's just the wine, that little bit of oxygen exchange that you get in a wood vessel or a concrete vessel versus a stainless steel vessel allows the wine to develop in ways that it doesn't otherwise.
Sure.
And a few years ago I did an experiment, actually, not with this wine, with one of my clients' wines, where we aged some Chardonnay, same Chardonnay juice, in some older oak barrels, some new oak barrels of a couple different configurations, and then some stainless steel barrels. They're all 60 gallons or more or less. All of our expectations, mine and the client and my assistants, were that the new oak barrel would be sort of the least fruity, if you will. It would have all the structure and the oak flavor. The neutral oak would be kind of in second place, if you will, kind of in the middle. And the stainless steel wine would be the freshest and the fruitiest and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Well, as it turns out, and we tasted the wine after it was in the barrels for maybe 5 months, it was kind of in the late spring. The wine that was in the stainless steel barrel was not the most expressive and the fruitiest. The wine that was in the neutral oak barrel was. And the wine that was in the stainless steel barrel was kind of backwards and unevolved and not as aromatic as the wine in the oak barrel. So that quickly disabused me of any notion of using stainless steel barrels to age my Chardonnay. But also it was kind of an eye-opener to see that it is still better to age in some sort of barrel, some sort of breathable, if you will, vessel. And then figure out ways not to have it impart too much flavor in the wine.
So it just adds more dimension, more mouthfeel, probably more texture.
Yeah. And all of that I sort of expected, but it was the sort of the freshness and the just amount of aroma and fruit that the wine had that was a little bit of a surprise. I was expecting that to be more the case in the stainless.
Interesting. So I'm picking up great copious notes of nutmeg, vanilla. So obviously the color, it's a light clear to slate gold. Subtle, nice slight creaminess. Barrel fermented, you said, right?
Yes. Yeah. A little bit of batonnage, not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I stirred it a bit, stirred the barrels a little towards the end of fermentation just to make sure it kept going.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't after a lot of kind of lazy flavor.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit's fine, but
yeah, it doesn't feel like it's too deep and too rich that it would be one that you could only have a single glass of and just have it be something that you would just pair with heavy fare. It's one that it's balanced, it's delicate, and polished. So there's some nice finesse to it. I like it. It's a pleasing Chardonnay.
thank you.
Something I would drink, definitely.
That is the goal. To be able to have more than one glass.
And it's 2012.
Correct.
So everybody's raving in the trade. I hear that 10 was not so great. 11 was worse than 10, but 12, wait till you get our 12s because they're going to be fabulous.
Yeah, it's. I've heard the same thing. Mm-hmm. With my wines and most of the wines that I work with, or most of the vineyards that I work with, I actually really liked the 2011 vintage. Mm. It was difficult for late varieties like Cabernet and some other things that ripen a bit later because it did start to get rainy. Well, it was a late season,
okay,
and then it kind of pushed things back to where rain became an issue. Mm-hmm. Normally, I would say it was about 3 weeks later than normal. Normally, most things, Cabernet included, are picked before there's a lot of threat of rain. So that made it difficult. But it wasn't really much of an issue for Pinot and Chardonnay because they ripen early.
Sure, yeah.
So, in most cases.
Yeah.
So I loved the 2011 Pinots, especially. They were so fresh and lively, cool vintage, cool growing season.
Mm-hmm. So this is a great example. Sorry to interrupt, but this is a great example of where a consumer could look at a vintage chart and quickly think, I should skip 2011 because it's been lumped as being a challenging vintage. And this is a perfect example where there could be varieties that do well, and are showing well.
Very much so. And I mean, if you stop and think about it, you can't really. The kind of weather that Chardonnay likes, for example, versus Cabernet likes, is pretty different.
Sure.
And it seems actually, the more you think about it, it seems kind of unlikely that there would be one vintage that was great for everything.
Right.
But 11 was one of those years where there was more kind of a more dramatic difference between varieties and how the weather suited them. But at any rate, the 2012 vintage was good, fairly plentiful too. The 2011 crop was quite small, so that was it was difficult for growers. Yeah. But the quality is very good. It was also a mild season, so some of the things that were good about the 11s are also good about the 12s, and that the aromas are fresh, and there wasn't heat damage to the fruit and that sort of thing. And I guess for big red varieties like Cabernet, for example, it was quite different in that color was really good in 2012. If you're making wines with colors where it's an issue, Pinot's not so much not that big a deal. And there were no problems getting things right. There were places in 2011 where it was difficult to get food right.
The 12s that I've tasted have been phenomenal. Yeah. Let's go on to the next wine.
Okay. So since I've been going on and on about how much I love the 2011 Pinots, we'll taste a couple of them.
Okay.
This one is a wine called The Shop, surnamed because the vineyard is called The Shop. It got that name because there used to be on that site a pretty good sized vineyard equipment and kind of vineyard equipment shop, and then kind of a meeting place for all the field workers. And there's a little picture of a tractor on the label in honor of that.
This has been one of the favorites of our customer base. This has been one of the go-tos the last few vintages. I've got customers that were clamoring for this product, and it's a testament to what's in the bottle. So I'm very pleased to be tasting it again.
Well, terrific. Thank you, and glad to hear that. So it's a Carneros Pinot Noir on the Napa side of Carneros. I have a long history making Carneros Pinot because back in the 90s I worked at Sainsbury. And in fact, that's how I got to know the people that own the property and farm the vines. They're actually vineyard managers. That's what they do.
Okay.
And they farmed all the vineyards that Sainsbury owned. Sainsbury also purchased a lot of fruit at the time, but they own some vineyards as well. And so I've known the people that own and farm this properties. I've known them since, oh gosh, the late 80s. So going on 30 years. So I can't believe I've been around that long, but I have.
So the clones in this
it's
bottle?
It's about a 3.5 acre. Well, they've since planted a little bit more now. It's about 4, but in 11 there was a little over 3 acres producing, and it's split evenly between 3 of the so-called Dijon clones, 115, 777, and then a less well-known clone called numbered 459. 459 is a little bit later ripening than the other 2. And higher in acid. So it's not as well regarded in Burgundy, but it's actually a good match for Carneros because it is higher acid and
Sure.
it seems to be a little bit more forgiving, with heat and things like that. Although I do end up picking them all more or less at the same time. We're like,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask 14.4 alcohol. Seems relatively high, but I'm not picking up a lot of heat on
Yeah, and in 2011, all of the other Pinots that I made were sub 14, and in some cases significantly so. But in Carneros, it was actually warm in August leading up to harvest, and we always get a heat wave. Actually, all of California often gets a heat wave right around Labor Day, which is always when this is being picked.
Okay.
And so it was kind of, with all the wines that I made in 2011, it was sort of unusually ripe compared to many of the other sites that I work with. And it actually, it was picked later than normal, but not as much later as some of the other vineyards that I work with. I am not I want the wines to be balanced, and I don't want them to have this, that sort of cooked fruit, overripe character. And obviously, I don't want it to be 15% alcohol.
Sure.
But I'm not too concerned with whether they're over or under 14, as long as they're balanced. Having said that, I welcome either sites or vintages where I can pick the grapes and have them ripe at, say mid-13s, so that the wines are balanced, both when they're young, but also even more so as they start to age. But the shop is often a touch over 14%, and it seems to be able to carry it. As long as I don't push it too far.
No, it's so far on the glass. Aromatically, I'm picking up hints of cranberry, blackberry, kirsch. Color-wise, this is a violet edged to slightly translucent purple. I'm getting some nice herbs and some nice kind of crushed fruit. Really supple, really supple.
It's a I try to bring a fairly light hand to it. Carneros Pinot, at least with the onset of the new Dijon clones, has a tendency to be a bit on the heavy side, maybe just because it's a little warmer there. And so early in my career, when I was using older Carneros vineyards, we were often worried about color and body and richness and that sort of thing. But with slightly improved farming and also the new clones, which have much smaller clusters, color and tannin ceased to be a problem. And actually, what became the big issue was preserving freshness and having bright flavors and bright aromas. Something which maybe was a little bit less of an issue with the older, later ripening, higher acid clones, but became an issue once these new ones came into production. So, in the past, I would, I didn't have to. Maybe I didn't have to try so hard, and this was back, quite a while ago,
Sure.
in the 90s, maybe early 90s. So before the new plantations came online. I didn't have to be quite so worried about purity of aroma and things like that. And I really had to kind of, especially when I started making the shop, I really had to become very aware that if I wasn't careful, that I would lose the aromatics. I'd make a big dark wine, big stout wine, but lose some of the charm. That's more elusive in Carneros than it is, say, in the Sonoma Coast or Anderson Valley or something like that. So it gets a lot of whole clusters.
Yes.
I am very, even though the alcohol fluctuates and sometimes it's on the high side, I am very careful not to wait to the point where the fruit has that cooked flavor. I actually intentionally will pick. Let me back up just a sec. I pick mostly on the flavor of the grapes and the juice. Numbers, of course, are important, but mostly on the flavors of the grape. And maybe if we'd been having this conversation 20 years ago, I would have said that it's quite clear when the flavor of the juice, or kind of everything all together when you chew it on in your mouth, goes from being a little bit tart, maybe not quite ripe, to kind of full, rich, and sweet, and just really obviously ripe. And it's a pretty easy thing to spot. Like, for example, if you were to sample every single day, there would be a point where you kind of cross over. Well, what I discovered in warmer places like Carneros, if I wait till I cross over the line and then schedule to pick, I usually pick a day or two after that, it's too late. So now I have to wait until I think it's just about to get to that point.
Yes.
And then by the time I pick it, it's just right. So it's tricky. Carneros is actually the trickiest place for me to make picking decisions.
So if I was to say that you are more of a making the wine by an art as opposed to science, would I be more spot on than to say that you are making wines by science rather than art?
Yes. Although it's more... I suppose it's an art. I always think of winemaking more as a craft. Because you're working with, it's like building a nice table.
Sure.
You're a craftsman. You're creating something from good ingredients instead of just out of thin air, like a poet or a painter. Yeah. I would say it's maybe craft plus a lot of intuition, and then basically a lot of experience, kind of doing it over and over again and figuring it out.
Sure.
But really, the markers that are sort of sensory, like tasting things and looking at the condition of the grapes and kind of understanding what the vineyard does. And, if you're having some familiarity with the vineyard is really important. Those are the things that tend to steer me in the right direction more than just looking at analysis. Although, of course, every time I get a sample from the vineyard to evaluate it, I do check the sugar and all that kind of stuff, because you need to make sure that you're not somehow making a grievous error.
Sure. But it seems like that if you can have a good palate, but unless you have the experience to back up certain timetables in the vineyard where you don't think something is to the ripeness level that you need, that's the difference maker, it seems like. Yeah.
In my opinion, yes.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Okay. We're a little blend here.
Yeah.
So the next one, also a 2011, is in the Sonoma Coast, and it's a little further out towards the ocean than where the Chardonnay came from. The wine is called the Habitat, and that's a made-up name because it's a blend of two different vineyards. So it's not named after the vineyard; it's kind of has its own name.
Okay. They are
interesting sites. They're both within maybe a couple of miles of the town of Sebastopol, which is west of Santa Rosa by about 20 minutes, going out towards the coast. And it's starting to get hilly, although the elevation at the vineyards is not terribly high. It's maybe, I think one of the vineyards is probably about 700 feet. The other one's lower than that.
Okay.
So low enough to be in the fog, and it can be quite foggy at both sites in the morning. They're farmed by the same guy, and the reason that I was drawn to these two vineyards is that they are both planted to fairly high density. So the rows are 4 feet apart. In typical California vineyard, they'd be 8 feet apart. And the vines, so you have 4 feet to walk through.
Yes.
Or drive a little tiny skinny tractor if you have one. And then in between the vines in the row is 3 feet. So it's sort of like Burgundy, but not quite that dense.
I've heard the Toucalan vineyard was modeled after Margaux, which was also set with really short distances between vines. The goal being that the rootstock really has to fight to get its nutrients and increasing the stress level to yielding a better quality grape.
Yeah, in this case, I think, well, I didn't plant the vineyard, so I don't know if that was part of the original goal, but I think what is important about that high density of vines, as I see it, and why I think the fruit is so good, is the crowded conditions, if you will, kind of naturally limit the amount of fruit that each individual plant can set, and whether that's because it's the vines are close enough together that it's not quite as sunny down, kind of where the permanent wood is.
Sure.
Or if it's something about the competition, vine to vine competition, that slows them down a little bit. But for whatever the reason, that's true. So the clusters tend to be a bit smaller than other vineyards that I work with. There's not quite as many of them. We are very careful to thin to the right crop level, but it does seem like there's some sort of natural balance that is in some way influenced by the tightness of the number of vines.
Sure.
The other thing, and this might be veering a bit into the esoteric, but when the vine rows are that close together, the sun in the afternoon, as it crosses over, midday and starts to go head towards sunset, the hottest part of the day is usually in that part of California, is between 2 and maybe 4:30. So it's mid to late afternoon, actually. And you really don't want the combination of warm weather, and around Sebastopol it's not that hot. But if you have a warm day, say it's 85 degrees, and the fruit is out in the direct sun, which it would be if the vines rose further apart, the fruit gets much hotter, partly because it's dark, than it would if it were either partly shaded or if the sun was somehow not shining on it. And that's important. It's not just the weather in the vineyard, but it's what the temperature of the leaves are, and even more so what the temperature of the berry itself is. So on a hot day in an older vineyard, say in Carneros, where it can be hotter than in the Sonoma Coast, I can walk up to a vine where there was a cluster just sort of hanging out in the sun, pull off a berry and pop it in my mouth, and it's hot.
Interesting.
In these vineyards, because where the clusters are growing, which is down at the base of the shoot, so you've got the clusters, and then there's a shoot with the leaves, and it could be 4 feet high or something like that. They're protected from the sun. They're never in direct sunlight. And if I walk on a warm day into the vineyard and I pluck a berry off of a cluster there, it's still cool. I mean, it's not cold like it would be at night, but they don't get hot, and that preserves the freshness. I mean, you can imagine if you had a strawberry and you left it out on the counter in the sun and it got hot, it would change the flavor.
Absolutely.
Maybe in not the right way.
Right.
But if you kept it in the shade or in the fridge or in the cellar or something like that, it would taste fresher. Kind of the same thing. Yeah. And that in Pinot, I think that's really important, especially in California where we do have warm weather. The big challenge, in my view, with making Pinot in California, pretty much every part of California, there are a few exceptions, but most parts of California, is not getting the grapes right. We can get grapes right easily, Pinot Noir grapes at least. It's keeping them tasting fresh and preserving the aromatics, both in the field and then once you get into the winery. That's why, for example, we were talking about barrels before, that's why I use the lighter toast barrels and not so much new oak.
Does the thin skin of the Pinot have a lot to do with that?
Pinot is more sensitive to heat than Cabernet, for example. You can have a Cabernet cluster hanging out in the full sun and it doesn't care at all. Sure. Well, it doesn't care as much.
So is it as simple as that, that the hotter it gets, the thinner the skin, the more chance it's going to split with the heat? Is it?
That's true, although berries don't usually split when they get hot, but the skin gets damaged and so they'll start to shrivel up. Okay. I think though that it's, I actually don't entirely know why Cabernet is less prone to getting that sort of cooked character, although it can. You can if you leave Cabernet on the vine way too long, it'll start to taste like raisins too.
Yeah.
But it seems to be a little more sturdy than Pinot.
Sure. So this in the glass is a touch lighter to me than the shop, color-wise, fruit-wise. Whereas the crop had a lot of, the shop had a lot of cranberry, blackberry, and kirsch. I'm getting more of those fresh, ripe red fruits, more strawberry, more raspberry. On the palate, nice, almost I get like that Bing cherry and not Rutherford-esque, like with like a Cabernet type of Bing cherry, but that softness and that I hate to use the cherry lifesaver, but it's like the Jolly Rancher, not in a bad way. You're getting all those that nice kind of syrupy sweetness that you get off some nice fresh ripe red fruit. Excellent.
Thank you.
Habitat.
So okay, that one was Habitat. So now I've got a couple, actually, sort of library releases, if you will. This one is it's from a vineyard called Manchester Ridge. This is from the 2009 vintage. I am technically sold out of this wine, but I do have a few cases in the cellar, and there are. I essentially doled them out to a few people that are interested and deemed worthy.
Okay.
Manchester, this vintage, 2009, was the last year that I worked with this vineyard, and I didn't quit. It wasn't because I didn't like the vineyard or the wine. The ownership of the vineyard was going through some changes, and the fruit was not available to me in 2010. It turns out, in 2010. It turns out I can get it again, but I started making the Habitat, so I don't. But Manchester Ridge is actually a very special place for Pinot. It's kind of it's sort of the Mendocino County equivalent of Hirsch, or where Hirsch is.
Wow.
Which is to say, it's on the ridge tops, quite close to the ocean.
No.
So very close to the ocean and quite marine influence, but it's at high enough elevation that it's above the fog. And if it were at sea level, it would be way too cold to ripen grapes. But because it's up, kind of, it's not always above the fog, but it's above the fog long enough that it gets, warm. It's not hot out there, but it gets warm enough to ripen grapes. They ripen fairly late there, kind of. Most years I would pick it either the very end of September or early in October, which for Pinot is fairly late.
Okay.
At least in California. It was also always a very low yielding spot because in the spring, when the vines are blooming, it's quite cold out on the coast, even at that elevation. It's windier.
When you say low yielding, are we under 3 tons, under 2 tons?
Generally 2 tons or less.
2 tons or less.
Yeah, so low.
Yes.
And the combination of the cool weather, but also the fact that it's a little further north, and this is a little bit of an esoteric weather fact, when you're above the fog along the coast, it's actually warmer at night than it is, say, at sea level. So it compared, for example, compared to the Anderson Valley, which is just inland from where Manchester Ridge is. It's cooler in the daytime at Manchester, but it's warmer at night. So at Boonville or in the middle of the Anderson Valley, you might get, on a typical summer day, you might get up to 85 degrees in the afternoon, but it'll get down to 50 at night. So it's a pretty big day-night swing.
Yeah.
Up at Manchester Ridge, you might get up to 75 or 80, but you only get down to about 60 at night. So it's a much smaller swing, and plants, when it gets below around 60 degrees, something like that, they tend to just shut down. They go to sleep. But if it's above 60 degrees, they keep the metabolic processes continue.
Yeah.
And grapes will actually ripen in the dark if it's warm enough, and if there's enough, if there's enough sugar in the plant, the leaves and in the fruit to drive the enzymatic reactions that that are associated with making color and flavor and all those sorts
Sure.
of things. So what that means, and I'm sorry I'm getting a little bit carried away with the technical, is that if you're in a site where it is warm enough at night for stuff to continue to go on, that effectively shortens your season. That's how it is in Burgundy, for example. It's quite far north, so the days in the summer, middle of the summer, like July, are really long. It's actually the same thing that's true in Washington and Oregon. And that, in those cases, there's more hours of daylight and more hours where it's not cold, because the sun's out. Up at Manchester, the days aren't as long, but the temperature doesn't drop down as much. So things happen really fast in the middle of the season. It'll start growing, so the buds will push out and start growing a full month later than Carneros, for example. But by the time you get on the other end of the season to harvest time, it's maybe 2 weeks later than, well, maybe not Carneros, but maybe 2 weeks later than, say, Russian River. So things just happen a little bit faster. And that, in ways that I don't totally understand, that changes the flavors and how they express themselves in the wine.
Same oak treatment on this wine? Or?
Yes, similar oak treatment, not a lot of new oak, light to medium toast barrels, probably slightly different mix of coopers, all French.
Let's take a look. A bit darker in color than the Sonoma Coast, a touch more opaque, still translucent. I get a touch more age. A little bit of toastiness, a little bit of spiciness almost aromatically. Black fruit definitely. Smokiness. I'm almost getting like almost a chocolate, almost like a bitter, not bitter chocolate, but some cocoa represent there. It's a mocha. Definitely New Orleans style. I'd characterize it closer towards. If I was making, I hate when people make Burgundian comparisons because I say, well, which part of Burgundy are we talking about? This would definitely be more of the feminine, fleshier side of the Côte de Beaune to me. And again, showing well, and I'm sure still time left in this bottle. Case production had to be very low, I'm sure.
I think 2009, that was a couple of years
Yeah.
ago. If I remember correctly, I made 175 cases.
175 cases.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting us taste it.
Oh, sure.
I love it. Good stuff. From a great year, too.
And then, last but not least, another library release, if you wish to call it that. This is Syrah. So I made Syrah for my brand, between 2004 and 2009, so I don't make it anymore. This is from Hudson Vineyard, and it's a 2008 vintage. Hudson Vineyard is in Carneros, so just extreme southwestern part of the Napa Valley. I actually could have called it Napa Valley Syrah.
Sell their fruit to the likes of Kistler and
Kistler,
Potts and Hall, maybe?
And yeah, Potts and Hall. I'm not sure if they still do, but at one time, Kongsgaard,
yes,
Nyers, Ramey.
People didn't know what they're doing with the fruit.
Yeah. Hudson Vineyard probably, I would say, built its fame on Chardonnay. That's what Kistler does.
Sure.
Ramey, other folks, Kongsgaard.
Yeah.
But he, of course, has quite a bit of red fruit growing there. Back when I worked at Sainsbury, I made Pinot Noir from his site, and it was actually pretty good. Although I would say that where he is located, which is going up into the hills, that form the northern boundary of Carneros, is a little bit on the warm side for Pinot. There were a couple blocks that did quite well, but in the ideal universe, I probably would not have planted Pinot in those blocks, maybe Chardonnay instead, or Syrah. Syrah is actually, in my opinion, strictly from the grape quality standpoint, it's probably the best match for his site, and many of those sites that are kind of on the northern edge of the eastern half, the Napa County half of Carneros spans both Napa and Sonoma County. Where it's a little bit warmer. As you get up into the hills, the soils are freer draining. They actually aren't volcanical, though they look like they are. They're mostly broken down sandstone.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, they were on a beach, but because they're sandy and there's a lower clay content in those soils, they drain a bit better, and they're not quite as fertile as the heavier clay soils in the southern part of the Appalachian. So good red wine ground, and because it is definitely cooler than any part of the Napa Valley, it's a little bit tricky trying to ripen Cabernet there. You can do it, but it comes in quite late.
Sure.
But sort of mid-late season varieties like Syrah and Merlot really thrive there.
Mm-hmm.
And I, back in between say 2001 and 2010, was making Syrah for a number of different projects, based in or using vineyards all over the state,
Mm-hmm.
down to the San Lucia Highlands,
Mm-hmm.
and all the way up to Mendocino County, actually all the way up to Lake County. And Hudson Vineyard was my favorite spot because it has, and it isn't the coolest site of all of those, but somehow there's some alchemy going on there that the Syrah grapes, or the Syrah wine out of that site has the most kind of perfume and almost floral notes of any of the other sites that I worked with. Whether you picked it on the ripe side, or a little bit on the less ripe side, with or without whole clusters, it was kind of part of
Sure.
the fruit, and that's why I chose it for my own brand.
Yeah.
But it's a special site for Syrah, especially if, like I am, you're trying to make Syrah that's maybe a bit more in the tradition of the Northern Rhone versus.
You called it right off the bat. I mean, right off the nose, right from the first sip. My pick was Northern Rhone and Cornos. This was a dead ringer for a good Cornos. The smoke, that nice herbaceousness, and the bacon fat that you get out of a good Northern Rhone, all present, and showing really well.
Yeah, and I always find, especially when the wines are young, but even now, there's some sort of sweet spices, almost like citrus peel, orange peel,
Sure.
or bergamot, Earl Grey tea,
Mm-hmm.
that add a sort of a pretty note, not quite floral, but maybe in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that in combination with the more savory things like the herbal notes and the smoked meats,
Yeah.
I think it's just a really compelling combination.
It's a great bottling, and it's just another example of why consumers should look to domestic Syrah. I find usually at these price points, the consumers wants Cabernet. They have a feeling that they want to get more for their dollar, and they're unsure about the Rhone, domestic Rhone offerings. But and I find more on the East Coast, people are not as early adopting to domestic Syrah. But I'm a big proponent of getting them in front of people because I think that there's some great opportunities for people to get some great experiences. And this is one of them. Again, thanks again for the taste.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for
Excellent.
spending the time with me.
Yeah. Well, there it is, folks. We've got Byron Kosuge tasting us through some amazing wines. Stay tuned for the follow-up, and I will get back to you with some pricing and availability. And greatwhitesandreds.com. Pass it along.